Son for hosting us this morning. Thank you to the Emerging Scholar Fellowship Committee and the entire board, who also without whom this would not be happening. For those of you who are new to this initiative, this is a pilot project to support early career female Torah scholars who would like to teach adult education. More information about our program is on this particular flyer, this one, and on the Mayan website. Planning is underway for next year, which is the third and final year of the pilot. And so, I hope many of you, I've seen many familiar faces. I hope you've all enjoyed coming to learn with us and found it very rewarding and found the whole project rewarding. And I hope you will stay tuned for next year's scholar and join us for more great shiurim next year. And with that, I also want to welcome Rabbi Sarah Wolkenfeld, who is Neti's mentor for this particular session. Rabbi Wolkenfeld is the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria and the Scholar in Residence at Ohev Shalom in DC. And there's more information. She has an extensive bio. More information about her is on the Mayan website. And she is an amazing educator, and she has extensive educational experience, pedagogical experience, and I'm sure she's been a wonderful mentor to Neti for this session. And with that, Neti, I don't think you need any introduction. Again, if you really want Neti's bio, it's also on this sheet. Neti, please teach us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on a pretty rainy morning. And I was just reflecting on how crazy it is to feel like this is the last and final class. It's really been such a great opportunity to be able to teach and really learn with and from all of you. And I'm really grateful to everyone who made it happen, not just all the people from Bayan, but also everyone who attended and gave me this opportunity. So thank you so much. And before all of the classes, I always gave a disclaimer. So for those who have been to past classes, you're familiar with this disclaimer. And that disclaimer relates to the topic that we're going to be discussing, which is Korbanot, sacrifices. And it seems at first glance like the wrong choice for an educational topic, because Korbanot are not practically relevant, and it doesn't seem like the type of thing that we would want to learn about if we want to have takeaways for our own religious lives. But in past classes, what I've tried to do is to show that each Korban really contains its own message relating to our relationship with Hashem. That each time a person brings a sacrifice, they're standing before God in a particular way. And so when we learn the details of each Korban, we can hopefully be inspired by the aspect of Avodat Hashem, of service of God, that each Korban represents, and figure out how we can incorporate that into our lives. So with that background in mind, I want to pose a question to everyone before we get into the sources and start learning about the Korban we're going to be focusing on today. And that question relates to what I think is a rather cliche saying that we're all pretty familiar with, that relates to gift giving. Right? When people say, they're nervous, they're not going to get the right gift, and people say, don't worry, it's the thought that counts. And I'm wondering, does that line resonate with people? Is that true to experience? Is it the thought that counts? Is it just the thought that counts? Is that just a cliche? Or is there some truth to it? Yes, thank you so much. Sybil. Yeah.
Sometimes it's hard to get past that. You want to say that, and you want to believe that. But if it's really something that, for one reason or another, is not pleasing to you, it's hard to get past that idea.
Yeah, definitely. Does that resonate with people?
Well, I think it's that sometimes it's not it doesn't appear that there was so much thought. So it's the thought that counts, that you thought to bring a gift. Like that's like one level of that, that what you chose as the gift represents, some idea of, effort or understanding of the recipient. That's like a whole other level that may or may not be a parent.
Yeah, I like that distinction a lot, right? There's sort of the thought that you thought you would bring something, and then there's the thought that you put into the gift itself. I really like that distinction. And I guess another way to think about it, does it matter what the relationship is? Meaning, is there a difference between your expectations? Okay, you're nodding. Do you want to?
No, I was thinking the same thing. I think it depends on who brings the present or the gift, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Like last Sunday was Mother's Day, so I was thinking about like there's very different, I think, expectation that you have, especially if you have young children, probably of what your children are getting you for Mother's Day from maybe the expectation that, you know, I might have for my parents for a birthday present. They don't really get me birthday presents, so I don't have any expectations, but in general. So it might depend on the relationship, right? And I think that taking all of this together, when we think about our relationship with God, and when we think about a Korban as a gift to God, and when it comes to the question, when we bring Korbanot, does what we bring matter? It seems to be obvious that the answer should be no, right? Does God need our gifts? Does what we bring to God really matter? And the reason that I ask this, why it matters what we're bringing to God, is because the Korban that we're going to be speaking about today, the Korban Mincha, is a different type of Korban, a different material than all other Korbanot. All other Korbanot are animal sacrifices. But the Mincha is not an animal sacrifice, rather it's a flour and oil sacrifice. And so the question is, does that make a difference? And if you take a look at source number 1, the Gemara very clearly and emphatically seems to imply to us that from the perspective of God, it doesn't matter what it is that we're bringing. The Gemara says, V'shema tomar la'achilo hu tzarich, lest you say that the reason that God is commanding you to bring him these sacrifices is because he needs food, he needs something to eat. Talmud lomar im erev lo omar lach, ki li teva umoa. Right, the pasuk says, Hashem says to Bnei Yisrael, if I were hungry, so to speak, I wouldn't tell you, I wouldn't ask you to bring me food. Li teva umoa. The entire earth and everything in it belongs to me. Right? God does not need us to feed him. And if you look down a few more lines, the Gemara drives this message home in I think a very clear way, where it has God saying to the Jewish people, Lo lirtzoni atem zochem. You're not sacrificing to satisfy my will, Ella lirtzonchem atem zochem. You should sacrifice to satisfy your own will. And what I think that God is saying is that from the perspective of God, what we're bringing doesn't matter. But what the last line suggests, that you're sacrificing to satisfy your own will, is that from our perspective, it does matter. And that perhaps it does make a difference to us in terms of what religious goal we have when sacrificing what it is that we're bringing. And so the question is, from the individual's perspective, when an individual decides, instead of bringing an animal sacrifice, to bring this mincha, to bring this flour offering, why are they bringing it? What is the motivation? What are they trying to express to God through the Korban Mincha? And that's going to be the overarching question that we're going to try to answer. And I think the natural place to start to look for an answer to this question is the psukim in source number 2, the psukim in Vayikra that introduce us to the Korban Mincha. And as we've noted in some of the earlier shirim, the first few prakim in Parshat Vayikra describe the voluntary sacrifices, or the free will offerings. So these are korbanot that you can bring whenever you want to bring a korban, not just when you have a specific obligation, but at any moment in one's life they can donate one of these korbanot. So in the first parak, the Torah describes the korban olah, the sacrifice that's completely consumed on the mizbeach, what we spoke about in our first year. And now we're going to look at the second parak, which describes the korban mincha. And the Torah tells us, "V'nefesh ki takriv korban mincha l'Hashem, sula siyeh korbanai." That when an individual brings a mincha to God, his korban should be from sola, it should be from fine flour. V'yatzak alaha shemen, he should pour oil onto it. V'natan alaha levona, and he should place frankincense. I'm not entirely sure what frankincense is. I believe that it comes from tree sap, based on the research that I did, and that it had a fragrant smell. So they would not eat the frankincense, but they would place it on the mincha. And then the Torah explains exactly the procedure. You would bring this mincha to the Kohanim. There's an interesting procedure where the Kohen would actually use his hand chometz, and he would place that on the mizbeach. V'iktir hakohen et askarta hamizbecha. He would burn that handful of the korban on the mizbeach. And the rest of it, we're told in Pasuk Gimel, v'hanoteret min hamincha la'aron u'labanav. The rest of it was consumed by the Kohanim. And then the Torah goes on in the next few psukim, and we won't read this inside, to describe some more advanced types of mincha. Let's say instead of just bringing flour and oil, you want to bake something. And the Torah gives different options, different ways you can prepare the mincha. Whether it's baking it into loaves in an oven, or baking it in a frying pan, and there's flat frying pans, or deep frying it, so we have like more donut type things, and all of these different configurations for bringing a korban mincha. And so we get a lot of details about how this korban is brought. But what's missing from the psukim is why this korban is brought. Right? You read the pasuk of nefesh ki takriv mincha, when a person brings the mincha, and you wonder, why are they bringing the mincha? What are they trying to do with this mincha? Why aren't they bringing, the standard animal sacrifice? And the text is kind of silent on that point regarding the purpose and the motivation. So where do we look to answer this question, to understand what this korban is getting at? And so in source number 3, I brought you the Rambam. And one of the many revolutionary things that the Rambam did for the world of Torah learning was the way that he organized and systematized essentially all of halacha, really in a revolutionary way. He was the first one to do this. And when he was just a teenager, the Rambam wrote his commentary on the Mishnah. And before each section of the Mishnah, he gave this summary of all of the laws contained in it. And so if we want to understand things about Korbanot, a great place to look is the Rambam's introduction to his commentary on the Mishnah dealing with Korbanot. And yet when we look here, we discover a really big roadblock to our entire inquiry. When we read the Rambam, we find out that we might be barking up the wrong tree. When we're asking what's the purpose of the mincha, we actually might be asking the completely wrong question. So why do I say this? Take a look at the Rambam. The Rambam tells us that mine ha-korbanot hin arba, that there are 4 different types of korbanot. Okay, let's see what they are. So he says the chata, the sin offering, the asham, the guilt offering, the ola, the burnt offering, and the shlamim, the peace offering. O hadomel shlamim, or that which is similar to the shlamim. So notice, what's missing? The mincha, exactly. Where's the mincha? And maybe you'll say, the Rambam wasn't being exact. He really didn't mean there's only 4 types. If we read the next line, we see just how emphatic the Rambam is about this point. In b'toratinu korban, b'shum panim, lo korban yachid, v'lo korban sibor, zol ti echad me'ilah ha'arba mineh. Says the Rambam, in our Torah, there is no other type of korban, whether communal or individual offering, except for these 4. And when the Rambam says this, you want to ask him, what is in your Torah? Right? What about Parak Bet and Vayikra? Was that not in the Rambam's Torah? What does he mean that there are only 4 types of korbanot in the Torah? Right? We read the psukim, and I shortened it for you. There are a lot more psukim describing the Korban Mincha, and then they're repeated again in Parshat Zav. So why is the Rambam telling us, stop the inquiry? There's no such thing as a Korban Mincha. And I'll tell you, the Rambam, of course, in his halakhic code, does discuss the Mincha. So what does he mean when he says that there are only 4 types of korbanot? So I think that here, we're almost forced to say that the Rambam must think not that he's denying the existence of the mincha, but that it must be part of one of these 4 categories, right? If these are the only 4 categories, then what we have to do in order to understand the mincha is to figure out which of these categories it already belongs into. And if you look in source number 4 at the Abarbanel never quotes the Rambam, but you get the sense that he's working within the Rambam's framework and he's trying to figure out where to place the Korban Mincha. And he gives us his theory. And the Abarbanel says as follows. He says, Hinenis kiru haminachot hudem hashlamim l'shnei ta'amin. So he's going through the order of the Korbanot in Parshat Vayikra. And he says the minachot are placed where they are, right after the olah and before the shlamim, for 2 reasons. And the first reason is, Kidei l'sader madrigot ha'olot k'moshe zacharti l'mala v'yan hayta ha'mincha mikalam. Says the Abarbanel, the Torah wants to put the different types of olah, the different types of burnt offering, in some kind of order. and specifically we'll see in descending order. And the Korbanot is very clear on this point. Yan haita ha-mincha mikolam. The mincha, says the Korbanot, is a type of olah. So the olah, as we've mentioned, is sort of the paradigmatic korban of a voluntary sacrifice. It's the first one that the Torah mentions, and it's essentially a korban that's completely consumed on the Mizbeach. It represents one's sense of total dependence on God and complete sacrifice through bringing this korban. And the Korbanot tells us that we're meant to see the mincha as a type of olah. And he has two very interesting proofs for this idea. I think that they're very compelling proofs, where he notices something about the presentation of the olah in Parak Aleph. So if you take a look in source number 5, the Korbanot notices that the Torah first presents us with im olah korbanot min ha-bakar. If you want to bring an olah from cattle, a cow, that's the first type of olah that the Torah talks about. But a cow is a big and expensive animal. And so after presenting us with the procedure for bringing a cow, the Torah goes on in a few psukim later to tell us, you can bring an olah from a different type of animal. Im min hatson korbano, min hakvasim, o min ha'izet. If you can't afford a cow, then you can bring from sheep. You can bring from sheep or goats. And then it describes the procedure for the sheep and the goats. And then finally, a few psukim later, it tells us about a different type of olah. Im min ha'of olah korbano la'Hashem. If you want to bring a bird offering, and it describes bringing an olah from turtle doves or pigeons, which are clearly a much cheaper option, right? To bring 2 pigeons is a much cheaper option than to bring an entire cow. And so the Korbanot suggests that the mincha follows immediately after these psukim. It's the very next parak, because the mincha represents the cheapest option. If you can't even afford to bring these birds, here's another option. Bring a korban from flour, bring a korban mincha. And to really emphasize his point, the Korbanot shows us that we have this structure, the idea of having more expensive korbanot and then going to cheaper options, also when it comes to the chata, to the sin offering, where if you look in source number 6, it's a particular type of sin offering that the Torah is talking about, but it tells us about bringing a sin offering min hatson, from sheep. But in Pasuk Zayin, the Torah says, "V'im lo tagia yado deiseh." If a person cannot afford to bring a sheep, there's another option. Hiviyat hashamo asher kata shtei torim o shnei b'nei yonah. He can bring birds. He can bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. And then a few psukim later, the Torah tells us, and in lo tasid yado l'shtei torim. If he can't even afford these birds, then he can bring a flour offering, a sirit ha'ifa sola, right, a certain measurement of flour. And what the Korbanot tells us is that it's not just when it comes to obligatory offerings, when God says, okay, since you have to bring this and you need to fulfill your obligation, I'll give the poor person the option to fulfill their obligation in a cheaper way. What the Korbanot says is that it's also for the olah, for voluntary offerings, that we want everyone to be able to volunteer to bring a korban if they want. And so the Torah adds the mincha after discussing the animal olot to give this option to all people. And I think that the message, I'll take your question. Did you have a question? Oh, sorry, I raised your hand. Okay. And I think that it's no coincidence that this message, this idea that, service of God and genuine service of God shouldn't be based on one's socioeconomic status, right? We might think that with Korbanot, when we're giving gifts to God, we sort of run the risk of turning this into a rich person's game, right? The rich people can bring more Korbanot. But lest we think that, the Torah comes and gives us the mincha. And I think it's no coincidence that that idea is expressed in the final Mishnah in Masechet Menachot. The tractate of Talmud that deals with the mincha ends off on just this note, where the Mishnah says, "Namar be'ula behima isha reach michoach." Right? It says regarding the ula behima, the sacrifice, the ula from an animal, that it's a pleasant, pleasing odor before God. Hu be'ula ha'uf isha reach michoach, and it says the same thing regarding the bird sacrifice. And so too with the mincha, with the flour offering, it tells us that this is a pleasant offering before God. And why does it do this? Lomar locha, echad hamarba ve'echad hamamet ubilvad she'chavin libo l'shamayim. To tell us that one that does a lot and one that does a little, it doesn't matter, as long as one's heart is directed towards God. In other words, it's really the thought that counts when it comes to these korbanos. And so that is the Abarbanel's theory of the mincha. So I want to ask you to evaluate, right, whether you find this theory convincing. I've showed you the proofs that the Abarbanel has. Does this make sense based on what you've seen in the psukim as a way to understand the mincha? That after it tells us about the animal olah, it tells us about the mincha, which is really kind of a flour olah, a way to bring a cheaper olah. Pretty good. Yeah, nods.
You mentioned for the one type of hot pot offering, you can also bring like grain, like maybe bacon or things for the hot pot?
That's a really good question. The answer is no. For the sin offering, it's a great question. The sin offering is brought from flour, but it can't be brought in an elaborate ways that a mincha is, and we're going to talk about that being an option. So yeah, the answer is no.
It's a little different then. It can't just be this, like going down in monetary fairly fancy ways.
Exactly, right? What Sarah's pointing out is that it's true that the mincha, is afterwards and it's a different material, but it's not just a different material. It also seems to have certain unique halachos to it, right, that make it seem like more than just, right, we'll call the Abarbanel's theory the poor man's olah. It seems to be more than just that. Did you want to say something also?
There could be times in the year when it was harder to get flour than to get an animal, like probably at the end of the winter when the animals are having, calving and birthing, but all the wheat is run out. So it could actually be something more special at that time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think thinking about the practicalities is a very interesting angle. I saw there are certain Bible scholars who debate whether is it really true that the mincha was such a cheap offering, right? Oil, it was pretty expensive. It was more of a luxury. And levona, this frankincense, which I said I'm not sure what it was. So scholars say that might have been something expensive. You only had to put very, very little on the mincha. But I think you're pointing out, right, that sometimes at the end of the season, before the new crop comes in, grain isn't necessarily available. So yeah, it's a very interesting point.
The fact that a fair amount of the mincha goes to the Kohanim and only a little bit gets burnt down in the Mizbeach makes it different from the other olah.
Yes, excellent, right? That is another question that I think that we have to raise, right? Which is, and I'll remind me your name, sorry? Joyce, thank you. And I'll take these questions together and summarize them, which is when we look at the Abarbanel's theory, on the one hand, it's very compelling. But on the other hand, there do seem to be certain problems with it. And one is the problem that Sarah pointed out, which is that it seems that the mincha has certain unique halachos that make it special, that make it different from an olah. And then there's a more specific problem that Joyce pointed to, which is the fact that, as we said, an olah is completely consumed on the mizbeach. And the mincha is almost the opposite, right? The Kohen takes a little scoop of it, a pomat's a handful, that gets burned on the mizbeach, but the rest of it is eaten by the Kohanim. So it doesn't feel like an olah, it doesn't feel like this move of complete sacrifice to God. And I'll just add, right, when we look at the way that the Torah describes in source 6, the different options for the sin offering, right, for the chatat, the Torah says before each new option, in lo tasig yado deiseh, right, if you cannot afford the sheep, here's what you should bring. But we don't have that language in the psukim for the olah. Right? The psukim for the olah seem to more be different options, not necessarily about if you can't afford it, just these are all different animals that you can bring for a korban. So with all of that in mind, I want to take what the Abarbanel said, I want to accept sort of his broad premise that this is a type of olah, that it fits under the umbrella of olah in some way, but instead of just saying that it's the poor man's olah, I think we can build up a more interesting picture of the mincha really having its own independent qualities and having a different meaning from a standard olah. And that's what I want to do with you right now. And I want to look at 3 different laws that are unique to the Korban Mincha. And And I think that if we take these three halachot together, we can really build a picture of what the special meaning of the mincha is. And we can appreciate that there would be a reason for an individual to choose to bring a mincha beyond just, this is the flour that I have in my house, I don't have an animal on me, so I'll bring a mincha instead. And so if you look at source number 8, the Torah tells us, the Mishnah tells us an interesting halacha. The Mishnah says, Ein shnayim mitnadvin isaron echad, that two people cannot jointly donate one isaron. And isaron is a measurement. We'll speak actually about it more in the next few sources. It's 1/10 of an ephah. That doesn't mean so much to me. The conversion now is 2.2 liters. That also happens to not mean so much to me because I'm not good with spatial things, but I guess like 2 soda bottles. That's how I think of it. Maybe 1 soda bottle, I'm not sure. So that amount, right, is the standard amount for a mincha. So 2 people, what this Mishnah is telling us, the main point, is that I can't decide I want to donate a mincha together with my friend. We're going to jointly go in on this together. Aval mitnadvin ola v'shlamim v'of afilu pri da'acha. But says the Mishnah, that's only true when it comes to the mincha. But when it comes to an ola and a shlamim, and even when you're bringing it from a bird, you can donate together. You can decide, my sisters and I all want to chip in for this animal and bring it as an ola. And it's interesting that the mincha would be an outlier in this way. That the mincha would be the one korban that can only be brought by a single person, and that can't be brought by a group. And the Gemara asks, my time, what's the reason? Why is it that 2 people can't join together to bring a mincha? And it says, mishum dichtiv ba nefesh. Because when the Torah introduces the possibility of the mincha to us, it says nefesh ki takriv. Right? The word nefesh literally is a soul. And that sounds really like an individual. That sort of emphasizes the individual soul much more so than the word, right, ish, a person. Okay, so you can have multiple people. But this is a soul, a nefesh. Right? And the Gemara at the end really highlights this idea in the last 2 lines, where the Gemara says, Hakol ba'in b'shutvas, that all other korbanot can come with partnerships, can come from people joining together. Mosili kakatav ela mincha, shenamar nefesh. The Torah only excluded the mincha because the mincha is described as being brought by a nefesh, by an individual person. So why is that? Seems a little strange, or it just seems random. Right? Why is the mincha the only korban that cannot be brought by a shutva, by a partnership of individuals? Why does it need to be brought by one individual? And if we take a look at the next source, this is going to seem like another detail, but I think these 2 details connect really well to start to give us a clue as to what the mincha is all about. So, as I mentioned before, there's a measurement called an isaron, right? Isaron comes from the word eser, so it's a tenth of an ephah, and that is the minimum measurement for a mincha. And if we look at the bolded part of the Mishnah, right, the Mishnah tells us that chetzi isaron, if an individual says, I pledge to bring half an isaron to the mikdash, it doesn't work. Yavi isaron shalim. He has to bring 1 full isaron. And this is a unique halacha, only relevant to the Korban Mincha. And again, we might wonder, why, right? This seems pretty random. And so, Levites, who's one of the most accomplished and well-known Tanakh teachers of the 20th century, she has gilionot, she has notes on each parsha. And so she mentions this halacha, and she says, underneath that, see Shemot Parak Tet Zayin. Right? Look in Shemot, which is intriguing, right? If I would, I'm reading about the mincha, the measurement for the mincha, oh, look at Sefer Shemot, look at the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim, or whatever it is, that'll help you. So, very intriguing, but I want to look at Shemot, that parak with you, and I think you'll all see why Levites is drawing our attention to this pasuk. So, the Torah in Parak Zayin of Shemot is describing the man. And when Hashem tells Bnei Yisrael about the man, he explains exactly how they're going to gather it. Zeh hadavar asher tziva Hashem, liktu mimenu ish lefi ochlo, omer legogula nispar nafsho sicham. Right? The Torah tells us this is what you should do. Each person should gather as much as they need to eat, and it tells us omer legogulas. That amount is 1 omer per person. And then, after after finishing all of the halachot and the laws and the different details of gathering the mon, many psukim later, this parak ends with a very strange pasuk. The parak ends with the pasuk, V'ha'omer asiri ha'ifahu. Oh, by the way, that amount of mon that I told you to collect, that is equivalent to a tenth of an ephah. In other words, a nisara. And this is a very strange pasuk. I remember, when you hear the Torah being read and you're listening to the story of the month, and then all of a sudden the Torah, jumps in and tells you ha'omer asiri ha'ephah. It's like, did we need to know that? What even is an asiri ha'ephah? But then you get to Sefer Vayikra, and asiri ha'ephah and isaron, those words are all over the place. And Rashi, actually on this pasuk, I apologize that it's not on the source sheet, but Rashi says on the words asiri ha'ephah, v'hu hashir l'minacho. And that is the measurement for a mincha. And so what's going on with this connection? So I think, this is telling us exactly the meaning of the measurement of an isaron. Because an isaron was the amount of mon that was given per person each day. So an isaron represents a person's food for the day. And if we think about a Korban Mincha in those terms, the mincha being, a daily portion of food, and sacrificing that to Hashem, we start to understand a little bit what the special role of the mincha is. And this fits with the fact that the mincha is a flour offering, that it's bread, right? Bread really represents basic sustenance. The word mazon, which is sustenance, what sustains us, birkat hamazon is what we refer to as benching. That's mainly a word used for grain, for bread, because bread is that staple food. And so I think that this also, fits with the idea of nefesh, of a single person, One single person donating their food for the day. Because in a certain sense, it's an individual experience to come before God and say, my food, my sustenance is dependent upon you. It comes from God. And so I would like to suggest that that is what the mincha represents. It's a way of showing that one's food is dependent on God and that one materially relies on God. And I think that fits with the halacha in source number 11, actually what Sarah pointed out, which is that the mincha can be brought in a variety of ways. It can be brought as flour, but can also be baked into loaves. It can be fried in a flat pan, in a deep frying pan. And I brought you the Rambam in source number 11, really goes through the procedure for bringing these different types of baked menachos. And if you read it, it sounds like you're cooking, and you are cooking, The Rambam tells us you would take oil, you would put that in the pot first, it's a recipe, and then you would put flour over it, and then you would put some more oil, you would mix it up, you would knead it, etc. So when we put our heads into the experience of the individual who chooses to bring the mincha, this individual is baking food. They're literally preparing the food that they would be eating and taking that prepared food and bringing it to the Beit HaMikdash. And I think this helps us understand how the material really changes the meaning of the korban. Because other korbanot are not food. It's true that after you bring an animal, it might be cooked and eaten as food. But an animal is an animal. That's what you're bringing to the mikdash. But when you bring a mincha, you're actually making food, you're taking it, and you're preparing it and bringing that to the mikdash. And I saw Professor Yoni Grossman from Bar Ilan has a book about Korbanot. And he develops something similar. I was very excited about it, relating to the Korban Mincha. And he had this great point that I thought really solidified this idea, where he said, why is it that there are different options for preparing the mincha, but not for other korbanot? Because when we think about food, food is a personal thing. We all have our personal preference, our preferred way of preparing our food. And so when we bring the mincha, we're really meant to kind of pick, how do we like our food? How do we like our bread cooked? And to pick that and to make that personal connection, and as that nefesh, as that person, bring that food to God and say, this sustenance, this food, all comes from God. It all depends on Him. And so I think that taking all of this, we can appreciate how, on the one hand, we're working within the framework set by the Abar Banel, but we're moving past it a little bit and saying that the mincha is more than just the poor man's olah. But I want to come back to the question that Joyce raised, relating to what part of the mincha is actually being brought on the mizbeach. And at first, we kind of asked this question in a technical way, right? Technically speaking, the olah is fully burnt. If the mincha is a type of olah, it should also be fully burnt. And now we can add another layer to how we ask the question, because I think once we understand the meaning of the mincha, the question becomes even stronger. If the purpose of the mincha is to express this dependence, then it also makes sense that we would give it fully to God, that we would take our food and give it as a complete gift to God. So again, we have to wonder, why isn't the mincha being fully sacrificed to Hashem? Why is only such a small amount of komets, just a handful, being placed on the mizbeach? And I should note, by the way, that amount, that handful, it really reminds me exactly of this food idea, right? Because if you think of the Kohen scooping in his hand to take, it's really like eating food. Like he's taking from the bread, scooping a little bit of it. So I just thought that also, yes.
So one of the things that's, I mean, just as you're saying this, goes through my mind is, you know, for the person who's bringing the mincha, you know, we talked about the fact that this is their bread for the day that they're giving up, and to what extent is the fact that they're bringing it and knowing that it's not being completely consumed, but that part of it, most of it, is actually going to support the Kohanim. How does that influence the psychological approach of that person to the mincha?
That is exactly the question that I want to focus on. I didn't plan to, I promise. That's exactly, and it's a question that I struggled with. That in preparing this year, like this was the question I think that I thought about for the longest, right? Because again, if the person wants to express their dependence, they want to see that food going up on the mizbeach. They want to see that big fire, that big column of smoke, and that's not actually what's happening. So I want to look a little more carefully at what does happen when we bring the mincha. So we mentioned, right, the komets, the handful that's offered on the mizbeach. And the Torah uses an interesting word to describe this komets, and it's a unique word that's only used in the context of a mincha, where the Torah calls it askarata, right? Askara coming from the word zachor, right, to remember. So it's some kind of commemoration. And Rashi in source 12 explains what that means. He says, "Hakumetz ha'ula legavoha hu zikaron hamincha." That the komets that goes up to God is meant to be a commemoration of the entire mincha. Shebo nizkar ba'alaha letova ulenacha ruach. That through this komets going up, that's what makes God remember and think of the person who brought the mincha very fondly. But what Rashi is telling us is that the komets isn't just part of the mincha is going on the mizbeach. It's meant to represent the entire mincha. And so it seems like Rashi's almost bothered by our problem too, right? We want the mincha to be fully sacrificed. And so we're saying that the komets isn't just part of the mincha, it's askarata. It's symbolic of the entire mincha. And the reason this is significant is because we don't say this with other korbanot. Generally, when we have parts of the korban that go on the mizbeach and parts that don't, we don't say the parts that go on the mizbeach represent the whole animal, because we don't need them to represent the whole animal. But for the mincha, it seems like we are trying to get at this idea that the entire mincha is being brought on the mizbeach, even if only part of it is actually being placed on the mizbeach. And this idea is further emphasized by a very interesting formulation in the Psukim. If you look back at source 2, Pasuk Gimel, right? The Torah tells us, after it talks about the komets, it tells us, "Hanoteres min ha-mincha le'aron u'lebanot." That the noteret, the remainder of the mincha, goes to the Kohanim. And I was really bothered by this word noteres, the remainder, or the leftovers. Because let me ask you a question. If you're making a big pot of chicken soup for Shabbos, and you decide, I want to try this chicken soup, I want to make sure that it's good. So you take a spoonful, maybe you even take a bowl, and then you serve that big pot of chicken soup on Friday night. Are you serving your guests leftovers? Is that what they're eating? And that's exactly what's happening here. The Kohen is taking a little handful, and yet we're calling the remainder noteres. We're calling it leftovers. And this terminology persists not just throughout the Torah, but also in the Gemara and in the Rambam, if you look in source 13, when the Rambam describes the Kohanim having a mitzvah to eat the menachos, he refers to it as the mitzvah lachol shayare menachos. Right? Shayarim are leftovers, the extras, what remains. And I think that what this word is trying to emphasize is that we should really be thinking of the mincha as though it was basically all brought on the mizbeach. Right? Generally, we think of leftovers in a quantitative sense. Most of the food gets eaten at the meal, and you have, 2 pieces of chicken left. That's leftovers. And here, this is obviously not leftovers in any kind of quantitative sense. This is the majority of the mincha. But in some kind of qualitative sense, we're meant to relate to this as the leftovers. The kometz was burnt. That was the main part. It all went on the mizbeach. Okay, there's a little left. We'll give it to the Kohanim. And I think we see this idea really strongly in the rest of the pasuk, because the pasuk goes on to say, we're giving it to the Kohanim, Kodesh Kadashim, it's holy of holies, Me'ishei Hashem, from the fires of Hashem. That it's almost as though the whole Korban is really on the Mizbeach, and then Hashem kind of swoops in and comes in and takes out part of it and gives it to the Kohanim. But it's Me'ishei Hashem, it's all meant to be on the Mizbeach. And this idea that the Kohanim are really eating Me'ishei Hashem, so it really does, I think, to a certain extent, help with this problem, right? We want the mincha to be fully consumed, and now we're saying that that's exactly what we're trying to get at. However, we might wonder, does the fact that ultimately, practically, the Kohanim are still eating and consuming it, does that in some way undermine the meaning of this? The fact that I'm fully giving this to God. So the Bechor Shor in source 14 kind of takes it as a given that this is not a problem, that giving it to the Kohanim is really not in tension with the idea of giving it to God. And he explains as follows: Yisrael mevi minchato u'maktir hakometz v'hashar ochlam hakohanim. That the Jew brings his mincha, he burns the kometz, and the remainder is eaten by the Kohanim. Shehin mishartim shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because the Kohanim are the servants of God. V'nimtzit kulo doro. And if God's servants are eating it, then all of it, kula, is really dorod, is a gift to God. And we should note that that language of dorod comes actually from the Korban Olah, where the Olah is described as kula dorod, a full gift to God. And this idea that when we're giving a mincha, we're really just donating to the house of God. And then, God might decide that he wants to take part of the mincha and, feed it to the Kohanim. It comes through really beautifully in a medrash. Sorry to make you skip it in your source sheet, but a medrash in source 18, where the Torah is describing Hashem's appointment of the Kohanim. And Rabbi Yitzchak gives the following metaphor. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Mashal la'ohavo shal melech, shetigro v'asa'o, I'm going to try to read this word, protectator. It sounds like protector, I don't know. You have a parable of the beloved of the king, who the king hires, and he appoints him to be the head of the palace. Shelo yehi zaz mipatin, ve'uchal musrav shal melech. That this person, who's now the head of the palace, he shouldn't leave the palace, and he should eat the leftovers of the king. And says the Medrash, Kach Aaron, hayashavel lekol Yisrael, v'asa'o HaKadosh Baruch Hu kohen gadol. And similarly, when it comes to Aaron, Aaron was initially, on the same playing field as all of the Jewish people, and then Hashem appointed him to be the high priest, v'amar lei, u'min hamikdash lo yatza. And he said to him, this is actually something we read in last week's parsha yesterday, do not leave the mikdash. The mikdash is now your home. You are in charge of it. And what's a consequence of it? The fact that you live in God's home. Ochel musrav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When you live somewhere, you eat the leftovers. And so you'll eat the leftovers, as it were, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of God. Shene'emar v'hanuseres min hamincha. And what's the korban that's described as leftovers? The mincha. The kohen eating the mincha is really eating the leftovers of the house of God. It's all me'ishei Hashem, it's all given to God, and the Kohanim eat it, so to speak, as God's servants, as his leftovers. And I think it's a nice idea that the way that we're expressing our dependence on Hashem for sustenance also happens happens to end up sustaining the Kohanim. So I want to take this a little bit further in a moment, but I just want to stop for a second to ask if anyone has any questions on anything that we've said up until this point.
When it's already a cooked shakes, just take a handful from that, break off a piece. So that seems like not to work with that way of doing things.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm trying to see if I have the pasuk for you. I can just, if you look actually in source number 2, after the Torah is describing the different ways that you can bake it. So in pasuk Vav, I apologize for not reading everything, there's just a lot of detail. It tells you that when you have the baked loaves, what you have to do before the chomet is patut uta pitin, that they would actually crumble it up, which is very interesting, and that way it was easier to facilitate the scooping of it, to crumble it up. I was actually speaking, because you mentioned this crumbling up, I was speaking with one of my teachers at GPATS, his name is Rabbi Nafar, and he happened to have told me that he loves the Korban Mincha. And I was very excited because it's rare, to be able to bond over the Korban Mincha with someone. And he told me that he had an idea about this procedure that you were talking about, the breaking down of the loaves, because it seems very strange, right? We're making the loaves and then we're crumbling them. So it could be this practical point, like you were raising. It serves this practical purpose. That's how the Kohen can scoop in. But he suggested that perhaps it's really a way also of showing submission to God. Because we bake something, we're proud of it, we've done something, and then right before we place it on the Mizbeach, we sort of crumble it back almost into the raw ingredients to kind of really show the limits of what humans can accomplish. So I thought that was a nice idea that he shared with me. I can't take credit for that, but that's the answer to the practical question. Any other questions?
I actually have a problem with that because it's not the person who's bringing the mincha who's going to suffer from the crumbs. It's the Kohen.
It's true. It's a very good point. I was wondering how exactly you eat it might be that you don't have to crumble the whole thing. So in that case, you can have, you can reform it after, I don't know. Okay. So I think that there's one, yes, please.
Okay, maybe you're going here, but just while we're in sort of the processing. So have you given us an answer to why Rambam excluded it in the beginning?
So I think that the answer is that the Rambam thought that the mincha was a type of olah. And I wanted to kind of say that it is a type of olah, it can fit under that umbrella, but not in the Abarbanel's very strict sense that it's the same as an olah just from flour, that it's a similar idea of a voluntary korban that we're bringing to express dependence on God, but different from an olah in that we're bringing food and we're specifically expressing this material dependence on Hashem by choosing food. Right? The other option would be the shlomim, that's the other voluntary korban, but the shlomim, for those who were at the shlomim shir, we learned about this, right? We mostly eat the korban shlomim, and so I think that would probably be why it would go under the olah. If you look also, I didn't bring all this material, but there are a lot of times in the Torah where it puts olah and mincha together in psukim, and in both of the lists of korbanos, they're next to each other, so there does seem to be a lot of textual support for this idea.
But you're sort of arguing that they shouldn't be conflated.
That they shouldn't be conflated, exactly. That it can kind of be the broad umbrella. I think that's how you have to understand the Rambam. To be honest, I would have probably said there are 5 types of korbanot, but yeah, I think that's probably how you have to understand it. Anything else? Yeah?
It's not quite a question, but I was learning this week's parsha, and we had a question that I think you'd answered, which is that at the beginning of Emor, it says, this is about the Kohanim. ולא יאכלו השם השם כי את אישי השם לכם אלוהיכם הם מקריבים ויקדוש. And it seems to specifically call out some korban that is lechem, but also is isha Hashem. And that the reason that the Kohanim have to be kadosh and not be tamei for their relatives and things like that is that they are being marked specifically this korban.
I'm so happy that you mentioned that, because when they were reading the Torah, I got very excited about this pasuk and exactly that language of Ishei Hashem. And when it talks about the Kohanim eating from other Korbanot in Vayikra, it never uses this exact language of they're eating Me Ishei Hashem. This is sort of unique to the mincha, that it's as it were Hashem's kind of taking the food off the table and really giving it to the Kohanim. And I want to just actually expand on exactly that point of the relationship between the Kohanim and the Korban Mincha. Because I think there might be something that's still a little bit unsatisfying in what we're saying, right? We're saying, that it's meant to be all given to God, and to a certain extent, we view it as though it is, but we get the Kohanim involved, and that's not a contradiction to the fact that we're giving it all to God. But I want to say, and I hope, that it's more than just not a contradiction, that getting the Kohanim involved actually adds something, and this is really to Deborah's point to a certain extent, to our experience psychologically in bringing the Korban. And so I want to kind of round that out. And I want to turn your attention to another aspect of the relationship between the Kohanim and the Korban Mincha. And that comes up in source number 15. We'll get to all of the psukim, but we'll start with the final bolded pasuk. And in general, when Kohanim bring Korbanot, the laws that they have for their own personal Korbanot are no different than the laws that we have for our Korbanot. But the Mincha is an exception. The Torah tells us, V'kol minchas kohen kalil tiyeh lo teachel. That when a kohen brings a mincha, it is all brought on the mizbeach. There's no as if it's all consumed. It's actually all burnt on the mizbeach. None of it is eaten. And this has practical ramifications. The idea of the kometz, right? We said that the kometz is brought because it's meant to represent the full mincha. But when a kohen brings a kometz, when a kohen brings a mincha, there is no kometz taken from it. We don't need to take a kometz. We just burn the entire thing on the mizbeach. And so I'm wondering if any of you have any ideas, right? Why is it that when the kohen brings a mincha, he gets his mincha to actually all be consumed on the mizbeach? Whereas right when we bring a mincha, it's as if it were fully consumed on the mizbeach. So why is the mincha of the kohen kalil tiyeh? Why is it fully burnt? Yeah, thank you. What's your name?
Sure.
Sure.
It would be so much stranger to give it to himself.
Amazing. That is exactly what the Rambam says. We'll read it in a moment. Did you have another idea?
Well, it's sort of like his two identities. When he's bringing them in, he's bringing it as an individual self as opposed to his Kohen self. And the only other way to do it would be to give it to a different Kohen.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And that's exactly the point that the Rambam makes. I brought the Torah quoting from the Rambam, but that exact idea about, and ideally the Kohen who brings his own Korban in general is the one that eats it. So he would have to be the one, to bring this Korban and then to eat it. And that would create exactly the problem that you're focusing on, that it seems strange, right? So the Torah says, quoting the Rambam, Pirush HaRambam, Hatam L'ki Kohen Makriv Korbanot Ba'atzmo, right? He's bringing his own Korban. Ve'im Yakriv Mincha Yakrivenu Ba'atzmo Yohana, right? He'll eat his own Korban, V'nimtza Ki'ilu Lo Ikriv Klum. And it'll be essentially as though he has not sacrificed anything. She'in l'mizbeach mimena ela hakometz v'halavona. Right? The mizbeach gets this little handful and the frankincense, the non-edible part of it. And so therefore, he says, L'kach siva hakatuv shetehei kula kalil she'ehei nireh hakravato. And that's why the Torah commands that it should all be consumed so that his sacrifice will be visible and will be evident. And there's a great line in the review safe before shore from earlier. I didn't bring it on the sheet, where he has this great line where he says, it doesn't look like you're bringing a korban, it looks like he's being mimale kriso. He's filling his stomach. That would be what it would look like if the Kohen would eat his own mincha. But I want to push this a little bit further and suggest that while this practical point is certainly true, it makes a lot of sense, it resonates, there's also a deeper point here as well with regards to the mincha of the Kohen. And that has to do with the unique way in which the Kohanim are really sustained and have their sustenance from Hashem. Because as we know, the Kohanim were not allowed to have any land, which in an agricultural society is a really big deal. It essentially means that they didn't have the means to independently support themselves. Their food came from the gifts that Hashem commands us to give them, and from Ishei Hashem, from the Korbanot that Hashem gifted to them. And if you look at the psukim in source number 19, the psukim in Devarim that describe the role of the Kohen put this, I think, in such clear terms, where the psukim say, Lo yiyeh lekohanim haleviyim kol shivat Levi chilek v'nachalat et Yisrael yishei Hashem v'nachalato yochilu. That the Kohanim do not have their own portion amongst Bnei Israel. What is their portion? Yishei Hashem. The fire offerings of God, that is what they eat. And it goes on to say, V'nachala lo yelo b'karev echad. He should not have his own portion amongst his brothers. Hashem hu nachlato ka'asher diber lo. Hashem is the nachala of the Kohen. And if we think about the mincha as the korban that expresses material dependence on Hashem, the korban that the statement that it makes is, I depend on Hashem for my sustenance, isn't this korban the most fitting korban for the Kohen to bring? The Kohen of all people knows what it means to be sustained by Hashem. He eats me'ishei Hashem, from the fires of Hashem. Or as we saw in the Midrash earlier, his food is musrav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the leftovers of God. And so perhaps the symbolism of the mincha of the Kohen being completely consumed is that the Kohen really needs the purest expression of dependence on Hashem, because he, in such a direct way, is being completely sustained by God, by the hand of God. And if you look back at the psukim in source 15, right, the Torah tells us that the korban that Aaron, Zeh korban Aaron ubanav asher yakrivu laHashem b'yom himashach oto asiri ha'efa sola mincha. The Torah tells us that when any new Kohen was initiated into service, what was the korban that he brought? It was a mincha. And specifically, the asiri ha'efa, the isaro, the daily portion of food. That was the way that the Kohen was inaugurated into serving Hashem. And it's a funny thing. If you would have asked me, right, what should be the korban that the Kohen brings at the start of his service, I would have never chosen the mincha, the korban that seems to be like the Abarbanel said, the poor man's korban, the lower type of korban. And yet now I think we can appreciate why this is the korban that's chosen to represent what it means to be a Kohen. He's entering into the service of Hashem and entering into this life of being sustained by Hashem. And the psukim actually go on to describe that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would bring a mincha every single day. And that he would bring this mincha as one isaron, so, a daily portion of food amount, but he would divide it into two. And we said that that's a no-no, right? You're not supposed to bring less than an isaron. And yet we break that rule when it comes to the Kohen Gadol bringing this daily korban. And he breaks it into two, and he brings half in the morning and half in the afternoon. But I think the reason we break the rule is because of the symbolism of how this works out. In the morning, right before the Kohen eats his morning meal, he brings that portion, as it were, also as a mincha, to say, my food for the day, my morning meal, depends on Hashem. And then later on, in the afternoon, when it's time to eat the rest of his food, he brings the other half of that mincha to also express this idea that the Kohen Gadol, more so than any other of the Kohanim, who really lives in the mikdash and has this command of mikdash lo yatsa, that can't even leave the precincts of the mikdash for personal matters, he is the most in the paradigm of what it means to be sustained by Hashem. And so I think that explains why the Kohanim have this unique connection to the mincha, why their mincha is completely consumed, and why the mincha is the korban chosen to be the korban that initiates them into service. But all of that is about the Kohanim. So what about us? And I think that here we can understand why we want the Kohanim to be on our minds when we bring the mincha. Why we actually do want Hashem to give some of it to the Kohanim. Because even though the Kohanim are sustained directly by Hashem in the most literal way, it's not true that only the Kohanim are the ones sustained by Hashem. We might have our own land and be able to farm it ourselves and make our own food. But at the end of the day, we need to remind ourselves of the Kohanim because we need to remember that we're not so different from the Kohanim. And every single day, 3 times a day, we say the tefillah of Ashrei. And Ashrei contains the psukim in source number 20, where we say, Einei kol eilata yisaviru, v'ata noti lahem es achlam b'yito. Where we say to God, the eyes of all creatures look to you, and you give them food at their time. Poteach et yadecha umasbia l'chol chayrato. Right? God opens his hand, and he feeds all creatures to their desires. And so it's not just the Kohanim that are eating, as it were, from the hand of God. It's us too. But it's much easier, I think, for us to forget that. Because we really work hard for our food. And that's important, right? I'll put it now, not in agricultural terms, but in modern terms. You know, we go to work, and then we have to go to the grocery store, and then you have to cook the food. And it's a lot of work. And because of that, it's easier, I think, to lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, in truth, poteach es yadecha umasbia l'chol chayrato. That when we sit down and eat our meal, we're eating our food, but we're also eating the food out of God's open hand that God gave to us. And this danger of forgetting that, of forgetting our dependence on God, is something that if we look at the book of Devarim, at Sefer Devarim, where God is preparing the Jewish people to enter into the land of Israel and to begin to produce their own food, that fear is all over Sefer Devarim. Right? I'll read for you the well-known psukim, where God says to Bnei Israel, Viram levavecha v'shachachta et Hashem Elokecha. That God is worried that your heart will get haughty and you'll forget your God. And the psukim describe all of the different things that God did for us up until this point, including in Pasuk Tet Zayin, Hama'achilcha man b'midbar asher lo yadon avotecha. Right, when we were in the midbar, God made food rain down from the sky. Our bread came directly from the sky. And it was easy to feel dependent on Hashem. But now, when we enter into the land of Israel, God is worried. V'amarta bilvavecha, kochi v'utzem yadi, asal li et ha'chayil hazeh. That we might say to ourselves, you know, I did this. Look what I did. All this hard work. Look what I accomplished. But it's not true, says God. And God says, remember, v'zacharta et Hashem Elokecha, ki hu noten lecha koach la'asot chayil. You are doing chayil, you're doing great things. But just remember that the koach, the strength to do that, came from God. And I think that that's why we connect our Korban Mincha to the Kohanim. Because we want to remember that when we express our dependence on Hashem for our food. And it also explains why we connect it to the man. Right? We pointed out that the measurement for the mincha is the same measure of the man that we got in the midbar. And that's also an important experience for us to remember, to think about the bread falling from the sky, and to realize that to a certain extent, our lives look very different than that, but fundamentally, they're not all that different than that. So to summarize and to bring this idea home, I think what we've seen is that even if the mincha is not quite an exact olah, it's a type of olah. It too is a way of voluntarily expressing one's dependence on Hashem, but the fact that it's made out of flour and oil, and the fact that it's food, really changes its meaning. And it's focused on thanking God for sustaining us. And it's about the nefesh, the individual, being sustained and dependent on Hashem for their food. And we noted that even though the mincha isn't fully burnt on the mizbeach, that's really its proper place. It should be fully burnt. The kometz is to act as though it were fully burnt, but we give it to the Kohanim partially as a reminder for ourselves that just as the Kohanim are fully sustained by Hashem hu nachlato, so too for us, we are being sustained by Hashem. And just to close off, I think that if it was true when Bnei Yisrael were about to enter Eretz Yisrael, this fear of Viram levavecha v'shachachta et Hashem Elokecha, this fear of forgetting God, even in an agricultural society, where it's, I think, easier to remember God. Because you're dependent on nature, you're dependent on the weather, your livelihood depends on whether Hashem makes it rain. I think nowadays that challenge of v'shachachta et Hashem Elokecha is even harder. It's all the harder because our lives are so removed from a lot of these natural forces. But I think that even though have the mincha, we do really have built in the halachic infrastructure, as it were, to have this message. Because we have the brachot that we make before we eat, and the brachot that we make after we eat. And I really think that these can help serve as reminders, maybe not in the most physical sense, the way that mincha really was concrete, but still in our minds, these mental reminders of where our food is coming from. And just to close off, I guess, the series, if you flip to the back of the page, I just brought, I know that not everyone was at every single cheer, but I brought just like a very brief summary of kind of the central message that we got from each of the Korbanot, and I left a section blank about how, you might take the message that we got from that Korban and incorporate it into your own life. So anyone can feel free to fill that out. I hope it gives you a sense that learning about Korbanot not only can be very fun and very interesting to kind of figure out how the details work, but can also really provide us a lot of spiritual depth. So thank you again so much for this opportunity. It's been great getting to meet everyone. If anyone has questions, you can ask now, you can ask after, but thank you so much. That is an unbelievable question. I was so bothered by this question, right? Did everyone hear the question? Why do we call the afternoon prayer mincha? So it seems that it doesn't really have to do with the Korban Mincha. Tosfot asked this question, and they try to figure it out, and they say, right, we bring a Korban Kamid, right, the daily offering, which is an animal olah, is brought twice a day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon. And they suggest that maybe, that's also, because the word mincha just means a gift. It's more of like a generic Korban word. So that's also like a gift that we're giving to God, and so it's called it on that. I wasn't super convinced by it. There's also the more convincing answer is that there's a story in Tanakh of Eliyahu on Har HaKarmel when he's trying to show Bnei Yisrael, that the prophets of Baal are wrong. So it says that it was at the time of Mincha, and he brought this Korban. And so that maybe, because the Torah is calling the afternoon mincha, and he's also bringing a korban, that might be related. But the simple answer is that it's not directly related. It's a great question, though. Thank you. Yes?
Another way of incorporating all of this into what we're thinking about right now is the fact that for the Sefer period, he started with the Korban Omer.
Yes.
And we're going to end with the Shtei Lechem, and those are great options as well.
Yes, I was thinking of I was debating whether to give this year a more specific share about the Korban Omer, but that's exactly right. And I think the Omer really there's a beautiful medrash that describes the mitzvah to bring the Korban Omer, where we're essentially asking God to make our green harvest successful. And it has this line where it says, the people sleep in their beds, and God, makes the sun come out, makes the rain fall, makes the clouds go up, and we just come and we give him the Omer, and we hope that that's enough, that that's sufficient. So yeah, I really like that connection. Thank you. Thank you.